But I am the event coordinator here at Doug, so I help run all of our local meetup programs like this one, as well as our regionals and just helping out with all conferences in between. So just here to give you a quick introduction as to who Doug is and kind of what all we offer. We are a free community for users, implementers, and resellers of Microsoft business applications. We focus mainly on Dynamics 365, GP, Power Platform, as well as AI. We really want to just be able to give people the tools to excel and grow in their professional careers. This is a free community. Almost all of our events are free. So we really encourage, everybody to gather together in their community. Our rules of engagement is we essentially ask that these meetups are held to be solely educational. So please no sales pitches. We want everybody to be able to come here and gain some free educational content. We also ask that you stay engaged with your speakers. So we want you to ask questions. They want you to ask questions. Lenore especially, she loves when people get involved. So this is how you're going to get the most out of these meetups. Just continue to stay engaged. And I'm sure Lenore will kind of point out how she would prefer that go about. Dynamics User Group, or Doug for short, we have multiple different programs that we offer. So we have open online discussion forums. We have lots of conferences throughout the year, which I'll get into in just a minute. We have local meetups like this one that are virtual and in person. And we also have a YouTube channel where you can go and view all of the virtual meetups like this one that get recorded. We post them to our YouTube, so lots of great educational content there. And we also have a mentorship program. So if you're interested in being a mentor or having a mentor, we'll kind of match you with who makes the most sense for you. But all of these programs are on our website if you want to learn more. We also have Convergence coming up. So if you've been around for a while, I'm sure you probably know what Convergence is or are familiar with it at least. This is coming back as an AI and ERP specific event. We're partnering with Microsoft to bring this back to the community, and it will be December 9th through the 10th in Miami, Florida this year. Very quick turnaround for our team. So if you're interested in coming, please sign up. Tickets are selling out fast. And I included that QR code there so you can learn more about the conference. And I'll also send it in the chat afterwards. We also have DynamicsCon coming up on May 12th to the 16th in Las Vegas. We have our early bird pricing going on right now until the end of the year. This is focused on all Dynamics 365 products as well as lots of AI. This will be multi-day conference, lots of educational content, lots of networking, good way to get involved with the community, and is definitely very applicable to everybody in this space. So I would definitely encourage you to come if you're able to. And then lastly, we have our 2020, I guess I should update this 2026 DynamicsCon regionals. These are going to be announced soon. We're hoping in October to get all of these announced. They are a little bit larger in scope than our local meetups, but not quite as big as the conferences. They're usually about 100 to 300 attendees. They're in-person, full-day events focused on all D365, Power Platform, and AI, and kind of different tracks for each. So we'll have those announced in October. Just make sure to keep an eye out on our socials. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Lenore. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully, no tech issues will arise. Welcome, everyone, to D365 Data 101. This presentation has a bit of a villain origin story in that it resulted from a conversation last year where 3 consultants that really knew their stuff all were trying to talk about a problem, and we were all saying we know D365, but we were referring to fundamentally different tools. There's a lot to unpack there. We all should have been more specific as a starter, but it really sent me down a rabbit hole in terms of really getting deeper about what these different tools, how they structure the data underneath, how you should interact with them, because in fact, it is quite different from one to the other. We're going to talk high level about data essentials to orient us, and then we'll meet the D365 family, which falls into 3 different buckets when it comes to the underlying data structure. Along the way, we're also going to talk about how to get your data to play nice together. A lot of times that's Dataverse, as well as how you can get the data out of D365 applications. There's different best practices for the 3 different D365 families, which is something I never would have realized if I hadn't gone down this rabbit hole. I'm going to pause for a second to mention when you have questions or ideas, feel free to throw them in the chat. Sevi, if I can ask you to holler out anything that seems like would be good to address in the middle of the presentation. Otherwise, we'll hold them to the end. And I know that we're all taking our lunch break to hang out right now, so I'll try to be efficient with our time, but I'm also happy to stay a little bit later if people have questions. Okay, so that's about the presentation. Here's me. Hi, I'm Lenore. The photo on the right is me blacksmithing. I love to make things in the real world when I'm not making them on the data side. I organized the Power BI DC meetup with my buddy Leslie, and we also recently launched Doug DC, which I co-organized with Marin and Chris Gill. And I launched a new business called Data Plumber LLC, where I basically help people make their data systems work and train up their staff alongside that work. Today's goals, we're going to try to do what we can to make cross-team collaboration easier. So much of this is about understanding how to speak just enough about each other's core areas of expertise. Demystify some confusing elements. Like I mentioned before, it is really easy to say D365 works like this and be completely wrong because you're thinking of a different application that works with fundamentally different underlying rules. And of course, my perpetual goal to plant the data nerd seed. If you get excited about data as a result of this presentation and you have questions, please message me on LinkedIn. I would love to nerd out with you. It is my favorite thing to do. Okay, so that's our introduction. We're going to start with the understanding data part of things before we go into D365. And that begins with understanding and having a core sort of paradigm shift around when we think about data problems. I really truly believe that when it comes to the most difficult data problems, we're really talking about people problems in disguise. And to give you an example of this, I'm going to go back to the beginning of my time as a BI professional, where I was working on a D365 FO project that had CRM added in. We had a big transformation. There was 20 or 30 different legacy systems. They're all being combined. And to make this possible, we pulled in a partner that was very well regarded. We loved them. There was a lot of smart brains in the room. And we had this parallel structure where you had partners on one side that were working with in-house system architects. You know, the partners data migration team working with the in-house data migration team. You had the BI team working with the in-house. If you're wondering why I'm the duck, that's why that's there. And then you had this larger group of end users who had a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of requests for reports, which landed in my territory. And this started off pretty well, but it started to fall apart pretty quickly because we weren't speaking the same language about our different tools, and we didn't have an understanding of from one step to the next how different priorities and different needs would impact each other. So we had this siloing that happened first across the functional areas, and then, of course, between the partner and the in-house folks. And my key takeaway as I continue to think back about all the things that didn't work on this project, where you had individuals who are all very passionate, who care deeply about the success of this, and who were really good at what they did, is that we had a lack of translation skill. We had a lack of fundamental understanding of what each of us needed. And that indeed we were all part of a data team. We just didn't talk about it that way. So my pitch and the sort of central thesis of this presentation is that we don't all have to be experts on all these different tools. There are far too many of them for us all to be experts across the board. But if we know just enough about each other's key areas, it can save time, money, headaches, tears, and make us all much more capable of working together with confidence. Data-related projects are a team sport, so we're going to talk through the people that are involved. And this includes not only the people you would think of as being the techies, right? The solutions architects and developers. We don't think of them as being data, but they are using a lot of the work that they do directly impacts how the data works. The in-house data team, these are your data plumbers, what I call them, the catch-all term that I use for engineers, architects, and analysts. They are obviously directly involved, but the thing that's often overlooked is that your end users, the people that input your data at the beginning of the process, that update the data throughout these different stages, say when you're working with CRM and you have different things happening in the pipeline, how and when they update things and how accurately they update them has a critical impact on how your data works. So my pitch here is that everyone is a data professional, and it benefits all of us to understand each other's needs as well as a foundational understanding of each other's tools. Let's talk about these different teams, and we'll do this really briefly. D365, and I'm bucketing this with the FO, the BC, the CE/CRM, all of the other D365 friends. Mainly when you have someone that's working to maintain and build these, their goal is to say, hey, please stop trying to reinvent the wheel here. Please use the tool the way that it was meant to be built. And they have a really good reason for this. When you do customizations, you introduce the opportunity for things to go wrong, or at least not the way you would expect. So they're trying to make sure that the foundation of these different tools that are ultimately designed to capture data and to move it from one point to another. Obviously, there's a lot more going on here, but as a data nerd, that's the way my brain works. They want to make sure it works the way it's intended. And they want to make sure that the work that is being done using D365 information, pulling data, just as an example, isn't straining the system. When you have D365 tools in use where people are inputting information and doing all sorts of interactions with it, potentially across the planet, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done by the D365 infrastructure. And when we are pulling or otherwise interacting with the D365 data, that can have an impact and strain, something we'll talk about a little bit later. You've got your end users on the other side of the equation. They don't care what's going on with the plumbing. And I learned this the hard way at the beginning of my career because I was so excited to talk about how cool everything was. And I'd have these glazed over faces. Most people, rightly so, just want the data to come out the way that they expect that it will. In other words, just like when you're in a house and you have literal plumbing, you go to the faucet, you turn it to hot, you expect hot water to come out and you expect it to be clean. The metaphor translates into data. You want things to just work. And then, of course, you've got your data nerds. I'm bucketing together migration and BI data engineering. But to break it down a bit, when you have folks that are involved with transferring data from an old system to a new one, and this can happen both in really big implementations and in smaller transitions, their job is to create consistency. And this sounds so simple, right? You'd think you'd be able to do a find and replace. But what I've seen over and over again is that when you have companies that have been working 20, 30 years on a bunch of different software, they're capturing something as simple as a customer name and ID, 6 or 7 different ways. And consolidating that becomes much harder and much more complex than you would think. Their job is to be the translators from all these different systems to the new one. And getting that precisely correct is often when all of the issues that you've ever had with the legacy systems, all the dirt and the data comes out all at once. It's a huge ask. So their job is a tough one to get everything to align well. And it's something that can happen on an ongoing basis as companies continue to evolve. On the data architect/BI side, if you're on an implementation at that stage, you're really waiting for the data to come out cleanly and you're messaging the data migration team every day. Is it done yet? Is it done yet? Can we start? The focus is on having clean data, which is the basis for everything else, so that the tools that you make, whether they are self-service tools that other people will connect to pull out data, or analytical reports, operational reports, you want them to be reliable and trustworthy. And you want the requirements for all of those assets to be static. Now, anybody in the chat ever had a data project that had static requirements, a report that started one way and stuck around that way? I've yet to hear anyone speak up to say that, because when we talk about data and data requests, it's very common for folks to get into when you give a mouse a cookie syndrome, as I like to call it, where you have a starting point, you start building out a report or an analytical tool like a semantic model where you're able to pull data out in various ways. And the people who requested it the first time suddenly discover what's possible. And once you get people thinking about what they can do with the data, there's an explosion of, oh, we could do this, we could do that. And that's beautiful. But it can be a challenge when it comes to prioritizing and making sure that everyone is able to get the work done in the time frame that's needed. So we've talked about the people, those three main buckets. Let's talk about key concepts, and then we'll get into the D365 families. Here are the 5 things that I think everyone needs to know regardless of role, because it makes everything else you do with data so much easier to understand. And I didn't understand any of these 6 years ago. So if these are a surprise to you, don't worry. Data tools specialize. Every action has a price. Front end and back end, not the same. Finding the right data gets tricky, and connections are everything. And because these concepts get kind of dry, we're going to make sure that we get specific and concrete through the power of bananas. Okay, let's start with data tools specialize. When I was first working on the client side on business intelligence, I thought that there was a front end, that D365 FO in my case, and CRM, and then on the back end immediately was the ability to pull a report. And nothing could be further from the truth. There's a lot of different specializations that need to be put into place so that different tools can be optimized to do their work best. And if we use bananas as an example, and you think back to the last time you were at a supermarket and you ran your products through that point of sales in the self-service aisle, think of every single beep that you hear the next time you're at the supermarket as a new record being captured. When you have this process occurring very, very rapidly, as is the case with the point of sale system, you need those items to be captured efficiently. Then a separate system is going to store the data. Then you have sales data that is going to get reorganized and consolidated so it's useful. I think of this as the KonMari stage. This is where you organize it, container source style, so everything works the way that you need it later on. And then once you have everything organized in a way that will be as efficient and useful for you, you store it in a data warehouse, after which you're able to have the information connected with relationships into what's called a semantic model. This captures everything to do with how your business works, essentially. You build in the business logic, and it's meant to reflect how your organization functions via data. And of course, you get to the endpoint, which is what everybody sees, where the report is built using Power BI or another tool with that data. So this is a simplified view. There's many different versions of this, but when we talk about data going from point A to point G, there's a lot more happening than you might expect. And that may lead you to ask, why on earth do data tools specialize? The answer is, it's expensive to do these different processes in the same way that when you learned about Econ 101 back in high school or college, you learned that specializing is a core concept where if an individual gets really good at one specific thing, they can do that most efficiently and trade with others that do other things most efficiently. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to data tools. We've optimized them to serve different purposes. And while there are tools like Power BI that are meant to be more jacks of all trades, there is a trade-off with the work that they do. So we can expand on the supermarket example now look at a specific example of those transactions being captured, know that they're being stored in a table, but recognize that as we're scaling, we can have one more point of sales computer working, and you're going to have not just one rapid series of purchases, but another from another customer who's buying. Expand that to however many people you saw the last time you went grocery shopping the day before Thanksgiving. And you start to see how scaling of these individual responsibilities across these different data tools is so incredibly important. Because obviously the grocery store doesn't want to lose any of their sales, right? That would be devastating for a grocery store not to have that captured so that they can make sure that they're making money. Data is reorganized. Here's an example of how it gets cleaned and organized into facts and descriptive called dimension tables to optimize storage. Don't worry about this too much. I just want you to know that there are ways that even at the individual data storage level, there are structures that help us specialize the way that the data is structured so that it's as efficient and cheap as possible. And so it works best for analytical purposes. And then finally, it's all in the data warehouse. So that's like level 2. 3, front end is almost never back end. I bet everyone has seen this color box. We have it in almost everything that we use with software. If we look at this fuchsia color, we know that there's a corresponding hex value, right? That hex value is how that fuchsia color is being stored. You wouldn't see that fuchsia color in the code on the back. And if you extrapolate that one example into the different D365 tools, you start to get a toehold in how, even though what you would expect intuitively to show up on the back end might be there in some cases, most of the time, because of the specialization, because of all these different needs to make sure that things are working to maximize efficiency, they're going to be stored in a fundamentally different way from what you see. 4, finding the right data gets tricky. I have been both of these Lockhorns. So on one hand, you have someone saying, why can't you just grab this version of the customer name on the report? I can see it right on my screen in D365. And the answer is, dude, it's just not that simple. So this is basically building on what you see is not what's on the back end. Here's an example of customer name. If we look at how that data is being captured and how it's being returned, you can see that there's an if-then logic being applied when it comes to the customer name, where the information is being stored using the customer account, which is a primary key. And then it's applying, I don't know if you can see it there, it's basically an if-then logic. So here's party type, and you can either be an organization or person. To get the name for the customer, it depends on what the party type is, and it specifies the customer's name if it's organization, and it's ignored if party type is person. This is just a really simple example of how on the back end, this logic that's happening to support D365 different varieties is going to be fundamentally different from the table that you just see on the front end. Big picture, that final report at the end includes a lot of invisible work, just like we talked about with the plumbing in your walls. And finally, connections are everything. Not those kinds of connections, these kinds. To understand how we're going to interact with data, it helps to know that the way that we structure and organize information is meant to do that optimization I mentioned a couple slides ago, where you have facts tables and you have dimension tables that store different elements of the data. In the same way that many of you have had information in Excel and needed to do a VLOOKUP to get related information in your table. Similar concept, but at scale. So when we talk about things like keys, we talk about things like being able to make sure that we have relational integrity. This is all about being able to say, hey, number 4011 is banana. I need to return banana correctly. And if I have more than one value for 4011, say if it's both banana and plantains, I'm not going to get the reliable output that I need. Okay, quick example, because I know we're low on time. When we talk about these different connections, we're really talking about having our individual IDs be the key to select related information so that we can filter, so we can create groupings, and so that we have the ability to organize our data so that if you have hundreds of millions of rows in the individual sales, and maybe you have thousands of rows in the budget information, you're still able to return a very simple report like so. All right, one last thing, and then I swear we will get to the D365 foundations. The common data model. I remember hearing a lot about this in 2022, and it's still kind of there. But one of the things that really threw me for a loop, because I learned so much about the common data model, is I really thought before I dug into this that all of the D365 tools were on the same data model. And that's not how this works. So there are elements and there's inspiration in terms of how things are organized under each of these D365 families. But uh, the concept that I originally had, that of course they were all using the same data model, is simply not true. However, if you start looking at the values that I have highlighted in these boxes here, and you compare them to what you may be used to seeing in Power Platform, in Dataverse, you'll notice that a lot of the standard tables are very similar because the Common Data Service kind of got absorbed blob-like into Dataverse. It became Dataverse, or a version of it became Dataverse. A lot of the core concepts are still applied in these different tools, but they work differently. So we've got all that foundation work laid down. We know that D365 has different data systems. Let's dig in and meet the families. When we talk about the D365 app families, it can be really overwhelming knowing how many different applications there are. So I find it helpful to think of them as three different core families. You've got the ERP applications, which have a variety of different members of the family, and an honorable mention in project operations. And then you have the D365 BC, which I like to think of as the little sister of D365 Finance. On the other hand, you have the CRM CE apps, customer revenue management, customer engagement. For a very long time, I was confused because those were referred to in different ways or interchangeably, but you'll find that they're pretty much the same. If we think about our applications as people, I like to consider D365 F&O as a family where D365 Finance is the eldest, and we have these other members of the family that are very business savvy. We also have D365 Project Operations. Now, there's a data home for D365 Finance and its related applications, and it has its own very specific data model that's quite robust. D365 Project Operations likes to hang out with the F&O apps, but its data home is actually in Dataverse. So I like to think of D365 Project Operations as living over the garage at the F&O house. We talked about the CRM CE apps. I like to think of these as the socialites of the family. Our customer insights, customer service, they're all living in a duplex next to the Power Platform apps, and their data home is Dataverse. So they have the exact same data foundation. Of course, D365 project operations data is here too. I like to think of this as like the boxes that D365 project operations hasn't moved out yet from the CRM CE house. But if we extrapolate off of this and we think of them as people, you can imagine how easy it is for the Power Platform family to hang out with the CRM CE family. They're over at each other's houses all the time. It's very easy for them to collaborate. Then we have D365 Business Central. D365 BC hangs out with some of these different tools, but it has a separate data model with different rules. Doesn't mean it can't hang out with the folks over at Dataverse, but it does mean that it's got some different requirements around it. And while it's designed to collaborate well with these different tools, it does mean that there's some configuration involved, which we'll get into in a bit. So when I first did this presentation, it was the day before Thanksgiving. And I meant to change this, but I decided the Thanksgiving metaphor was good enough to just keep it going. The key question that we have when we're talking about all these different applications is, can we get them to work together in harmony? Can we have all this data? And we can. If we extend the metaphor, can we have everybody at Thanksgiving at Dataverse House where it's easy for the data to all hang out? Yes, but how far their travel is going to affect how easy it is for us to get things connected. So if we think of these data homes as being separate and Dataverse House as being the place where we want everybody to hang out together, that is where we can start talking more about how we can get things connected to work in harmony. So let's start with CRM data. We already know some of this, but let's just recap. Where does the CRM data get stored? It gets stored in Dataverse. How does it get integrated with other apps, and how do I access it? This is really where we start talking about Dataverse is time to shine. There's a lot of components here, but Dataverse is marketing terms. So what is it? When we talk about Dataverse, we're referring to cloud-based data storage, a lake, with standard tables that we saw already in that previous slide with the common data model, but the ability to create all sorts of additional items. There's built-in security, there's plug and play, and there is the hope that it will reduce integration with tools. Often it does. The challenge that I always like to flag is that some configuration may be required. This is true for both BC and for D365 FO apps. And the other thing that gets confusing is, where is Dataverse? If we were in person, I would ask you to shout it out. The thing that kills me is they did this amazing marketing and they have this beautiful logo for Dataverse, but they don't use it. You have to go here to tables. And if you don't know to look for that, you can spend hours looking for the Dataverse app and not have any idea where it is. When we talk about integrating that CE CRM with other apps, it is mostly straightforward, except when it isn't. And there are a few examples that I want to call out. One of them is a dark horse. Every once in a while, you'll have folks that have tabular data stream turned off. If it's disabled, you're going to have issues. And the other is that you'll have to turn on integration for SharePoint to be able to have that component in place. In other words, it is relatively straightforward to configure, but it does require configuring. This is not a crisis, but it's helpful to know so that you're not assuming that things will just work. On the D365 F&O data side, which, if you're curious, is this little ghost guy down here, things get a little bit more squirrely. Where does the data go when I enter a D365 FO? What the heck are data entities? One of my favorite questions. Why can't I get the field I want on this form? And why does my report fail when I pull OData? We're going to go a little bit heavier on D365 FO, specifically because it's got a little bit more going on than D365 CE, and it's going to be harder to get it into Dataverse for family. So let's start with entities.
Lenore, before we do that,
are
there any questions from the group? Figured it'd be good to do a quick
excellent pause point.
Pause check. Anything in the chat? Well, I did have a quick question, which was, during the data migration journey, like what are, as a, being on the client side, the partner side, what are some of the common challenges that you see take place during that transition?
Yeah. So one of the things that really shocked me when I was working, after I worked on several projects that had not gone especially well, basically because I was working as a consultant where our job was to help clean things up after things had not gone right, was that data migrations are more likely to fail or go budget or go over budget or both than they are to succeed. The statistics vary, but the number that I've seen is something like 90% don't go according to plan, by which I mean they go over budget, over schedule, or they just get canceled. And that's a huge number. And thank you for asking that, by the way, Sebi, because I think it's a really important thing to know. The foundations for everything that we do in all of these different D365 tools is clean data. And the most critical stumbling block when it comes to implementations is the migration. So if you want to save some money and you're thinking about having a data migration in the future, the best possible move that you can make is also a really simple one, and that's cleaning up your data ahead of time and getting really clear internally on how your data works. A lot of times when you're doing an implementation, you find out as you go that nobody really knows how they want the data to work, and everyone is relying on how things have worked for the past 10, 15 years. Taking a step back and doing that cleanup work and doing that translation work ahead of time can save you tremendous stress and money. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Can you define like what clean data looks like? Or is that like completely dependent on the customer and like how they, as a group, define what that is? I hear that all the time.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. I love it. When we talk about clean data, it can refer to a few different things, but most of the time, if we think about a company that has, let's say, 100 customers, right? An example of dirt in your data would be downloading your table of customer information and discovering that you have 107 customers listed. And there are duplicates, and there's one that has the name incorrectly input, and maybe the keys aren't unique. So if we go back to that banana example, where we have 4011 being a banana, if 4011 is coded to more than one product, you have ambiguity, which means that you're not able to reference that 4011 code to pull all your bananas. Now you're pulling bananas and plantains. And that is going to be a problem if you need to be able to report on bananas and plantains separately. So clean data is data that is complete, that doesn't contain duplicates, and that has consistency when it comes to the elements in each individual column. In other words, if you have a column that is intended to be amounts in dollars, you should not also have a text string in there. And those are the sorts of things that can cause major issues. There's also the simpler translation problem where maybe in one system, your customer list is 107, and in another legacy system, it's 82. You have historical data that doesn't match, and you have to reconcile that. Ultimately, when we're talking about clean data, we're not talking about technical problems. We're talking about being able to accurately reflect how the business works. And that is usually a matter of rolling up your sleeves and working through the logic as a team. The hard part is sometimes that's when you discover there's some bigger problems with your data, and you get into the challenges around politics that can get in the way of getting everything right.
Gotcha. And when you say like completely filled out, you mean like just like there's no blanks?
There's no blanks where there should be data. A blank, a null, a zero can be a valid output. But where you don't want to see that is where you need it to connect to related data. So in other words, continuing to pick on the noble banana, if a purchase is made for a bunch of bananas and that 4011 doesn't get written into the field for product ID, that all of a sudden has no way to connect to all the information around bananas, and you can't reference it. So there are certain fields in any data set that have to be complete for them to connect to other data sources, and for them to reference related information. And when there's a blank in something like that, which is usually called a key, you've got a bigger problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. John, did that answer your question as well on the null data we have in the chat? Can it be
Ooh, there are
missing
questions
stuff
about null data in the chat. That is such a big topic.
to clean
It's a
up?
really yummy
Okay,
topic.
cool. Got it. All right, awesome. All right, great. I think that's it for now. Let's save. Feel free to continue putting questions in the chat, and we can save that for the end of the presentation. Or if it's really you need to get it answered, raise your hand and we'll address it.
Yeah, I have a question, Sevi.
Sure.
Regarding data. Now, since we have various accounting and operations, IT people on the call, would you say that this data conversation is more for IT or is it accounting related data? Well,
It's for everyone. Data is everybody's job these days. It really is for everyone. Do you mean cleaning up the data?
well, who's particularly should be most interested is the question.
So that's where we start to get into data governance conversations, right? There's a misconception that data should be owned by IT. And I would argue that that is the worst approach because IT is rarely the folks who are best able to determine whether a data point is correct. So if we think about marketing data, where there's dirt in the data and the information that has been input doesn't match up with what it should be. If you have a system where the people who are going to answer questions around data quality are getting tickets in IT saying the marketing data is incorrect, that's not actionable. What does an IT department do with that? Particularly if it's a small IT department, which is most IT departments these days. So this is where we start to talk about data stewardship, efficient systems to make sure that the information is being transferred to the right people so that they can address it appropriately. And when it comes to data ownership, it really has to come down to who's closest to the data, who can most accurately understand and intimately understand what that data means and whether or not it's correct, and putting the power in those people's hands as efficiently and responsibly as possible. There's definitely some areas that, like finance is a perfect example. There's sensitive areas where you need to be really careful about who has access to what when we get into data security. But it's pretty common for finance to own a fair amount of the data that's related to finance and accounting. And that makes perfect sense.
That's right. Randall, do you want to share about the banking, how banking data and financial reporting is affected?
Beautiful. I don't understand. Sorry.
Right, Randall?
Yeah, as far as like the
I thought
custom
he was
tables in
begging you.
SKG.
Right, well, yeah, as far as banking data and that's also in
He's threatening you again.
finance. I think there's a question.
I'm hearing
Yeah,
Here's some
couple of
background
voices.
noise, so maybe if that's happening, put yourself on mute.
Can we mute? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to talk about various areas of data,
Yeah.
you know, so,
Yeah.
and who's affected by that, which is finance, IT,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times the ISV tables, there's just not as much knowledge behind those two, where then we have to kind of fight through how does that data tie back to, what everybody knows, ledger trans, cus trans, then trans, the tried and true. It kind of fits into the question I was just typing right before John asked me here to chime in, but I get a lot of developers or let's say my partners that say, oh, you're going to need a custom data object for that. And they want to do it up front in D365 F&O and not do it like you were showing where you were kind of kind of bringing the tables together yourself over there in Dataverse. And I think it has a lot to do with performance potentially. I don't know if you get that a lot, or maybe you can just give me a 101 on why I'm always getting told I can't do it myself in Dataverse.
Okay. With the enormous caveat that I don't know the specifics broadly about your situation. Broadly speaking, I shy away from customizations because they open the door for things to become what's the term? Twisted in the system when it's not being used the way it was originally designed to do. So there are ways that you can make adjustments in the system. I have some slides about that in a second, so that you can have custom views that are different on the forms so that you can still get what you want. Those aren't really customizations, right? Those are personalizations. But when you're making fundamental changes within the underlying structure, it's a slippery slope. And a lot of the people that I've talked to about dual write, who work more specifically on the developer side, less on the data specific side, have noted to me that there's really specific challenges as soon as you change how these tools are initially designed to work. Doesn't mean you can't do customizations, just means that once there's the technical problem of it can have unintended consequences, and B, there's the very human problem of once you start making customizations and you open that door, it's very hard to close it. And that's usually where you end up with a lot of bloat. And then you have a system that's highly customized that no longer meets the company's needs and also has some issues with how the data is coming through. And then you end up hiring someone like me to figure it out. So
spin on that before, just since we're probably, these would be more custom object views, not the customizations themselves.
Much less worried about custom object views.
Okay, but is that common that I always have to get one of those instead of what you were showing, where I bring the inventory and the finance data together? Is it? It seems like it's done for performance issues, or where let's say you need to find out what that posting profile is for that item code or something along that lines. I'm trying to think of a kind of a normal idea here.
I'd love to talk to you offline about this in specifics, but in abstracts to respect your company privacy. There are definite use cases for that. When we talk about having those set up in Visual Studio, the specific reasons of that may depend. There are multiple different ways to make that data available, though, whether that be in that territory, specifically in Fabric, or separately in the D365, in the Power BI/Fabric semantic model. Really depends on the particular needs that you have. I will say that when we get to entities in a second, one of the things that's often a challenge is that entities are designed to be one size fits most. And a lot of times that one size fits most leaves out something critical that you still need. So it might be something that you guys need for integrations in a different way rather than getting data out. It's hard for me to tell without seeing it specifically. But I think there's some nuance there that maybe is not being leaned towards as much as I might expect in the discussions that are happening, just based on how you describe it. Hopefully that helps.
No, thank you.
Not the most specific answer. I'm sorry.
No worries. I could always ping you later with very specifics. So, thank you.
And I intend to become a certified developer on D365 in the next few months. I'm more on the data side at this stage. So do keep in mind that my area is much more on the data side, for what it's worth. Okay, data entities. And my friends, I know we're coming up on time. So I'm going to try to zip through a few of these and make sure we get to the key stuff. If you have to leave, I understand entirely. Oftentimes when we talk about data entities, it's very confusing. And I am not going to make you read this because it's a lot of data. But basically, when we use data entities, which exist to help us move data from one point to another, they are sitting on top of tables in the underlying D365 F&O model. And it's creating this conduit for us to update information both directly in D365 F&O and through tools like the OData connector that I suspect many of you have used in Excel. This is the way that we work with the model in D365 F&O without directly interacting with it, which helps to protect that core model. If we steal from Peter Raymer, who stole from Microsoft Learn, we can see that customer entity we picked on before. On the left-hand side, you can see how you can have one, what we call denormalized, which is a big wide table with everything connected together on the left-hand side, whereas you'll have a normalized version of that data with customer address and party separated out. This is that optimization that we talked about before, where data can be separated into different tables to store information efficiently. It's easier to interact with an entity if you're doing integrations. If you expect to see a lot of these data points together, it can be very helpful to have them together in one place, but they're not guaranteed to have the information that you need entirely, right? They're one size fits most based on what Microsoft learned and believes is going to be most useful to you. What that also means is that when we talk about the front end versus back end elements, those entities are going to come into play when we're using these forms. So when we look at a form, you've got a toolbar, which allows us to add and remove fields. You have a grid, not a table. You have fields, not columns. And then you have records, which are rows that are grouped together and have related information. When you look at that insert column option to be able to personalize your view, this is facilitated in part by those entities which are allowing that data to be connected together. And that allows you to personalize these views without having to make substantive changes to how D365 works. All of that is made possible by having these abstractions and by having this front end be holding information differently from how it's stored on the back end. And this is just an example of how this view can be saved, which if you haven't done before is a really great way to save time. We looked at the customer before. I'm going to zip through this. And we can see that you can add information there. When we talk about how the information is coming through, just to recap, you have the information in the front end. This is a screenshot. You update it, it feeds into that customer entity, and then it goes into the underlying customer table where the data is ultimately stored. That interaction means that the customer table is returning data whenever you're reflecting this through the entity as well. And you can also see more of this information if you want to go really deep in Visual Studio. Okay. Briefly, D365 F&O data, you have multiple options for getting data out. The classic was data management workspace where you would do batch jobs and you would schedule things to be exported relying on entities. Many people are also still using OData connectors for your reports. I'm going to encourage you in the few minutes that I have left with some of you to not use OData connectors and to work towards creating more robust options like Fabric or Azure Link instead. Because OData tends to work until it doesn't, and when it doesn't work, it crashes the day before you have a board meeting and you really need a report to be done. Why this happens has to do with throttling. So remember at the very beginning, we talked about how these tools specialize and each of them has a particular job. If you're overusing resources, such as using OData to pull information, which happens section by section. Imagine it's called pagination. You're pulling a certain subset over and over again. that can have an expensive impact on the D365 system. And this will be fine for smaller volumes of data, but as you have more and more data over time, you may have reports that worked at the beginning of a project that start to fall apart. And that's why OData is not recommended for D365 F&O. Dual writes, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. It is recommended on Microsoft Learn. Anecdotally, I've heard horror stories from people about challenges with dual writes. Choose your own adventure, but take care, especially if you have customizations. And of course, if you're dealing with connecting things together using Fabric Link, you're going to need to use several different sections to connect the dots here, including if you started a D365 F&O project on Lifecycle Service, facilitating the integration on Lifecycle Services as well. And making sure that you are adding in any additional components to make sure that you are aligned with all the core components in place. So, talk about all of that. Let's talk about once you have your data in Dataverse, virtual entities. Virtual entities confuse everyone. They're a reflection of the data. They do not store the data, which is baffling, but it allows you to see the data as if it were stored there and to interact with it as if it was stored there. This can be a little bit slower than you might expect, so take care as you use virtual entities, but they can be a very effective tool. I won't go over this in detail. Message me later if you'd like. This is an evolving effort to, the Fabric Link components are something that is continuing to evolve as Fabric evolves. The key thing I want to point out here is that there are prerequisites at each stage if you're getting your data to be available via Dataverse into OneLink. And those can get really specific, so do take care and make sure that you're following the individual steps. Okay, BC, very briefly, how does it differ? Can I integrate? And how do I use it for reporting? This is a fundamentally different data model. A couple things that stuck out to me between F&O and Business Central is that there are no data entities in Business Central, which blew my mind after years of working with F&O data entities. Instead, you have a different structure entirely, and that is a duplicate database, which means that unlike D365 F&O, where please don't use OData because it will explode on you at some point, you are encouraged to use OData as a way to leverage your information from Business Central directly in Power BI. So here's a quick review of how the data is stored in Business Central. You have configuration tables that you're not going to touch. You have working tables that are high touch. And then you have transaction tables that are posted, which aren't able to change. On top of that, you have this glorious thing here with the data virtualization, those virtual tables that you can interact with, but only really exist in the source data area. And you have this separate duplicate area where you're able to have that Business Central data available as a copy, independent from your production, your working Business Central. Then you have this one other thing, which is that you've got these slightly different components that you have to join up called couplings. So if you've ever worked with Business Central and you need to connect it up to work with Dynamics 365 Sales, you also have to add in a component to connect the dots between these two tools. It can all work together and it can be great, but there's an additional step here. It's not as seamless as you would expect. That's worth calling out. I find this fascinating. I think that's about.
Yeah, what we usually do is smart connectors, an import tool, as Randall mentioned, ISV, and bring in all the data from any other source, and QuickBooks, bring it into Business Central.
Love it. I will look forward to looking through all of your notes after this chat. This has been fun. But yeah, unlike what we did in D365 F&O, OData is totally okay. because you'll be hitting a read-only database, which is a replica of the main, which means you won't be negatively impacting performance. Although I really want to know how things went before February of 2022. I have questions. So I zipped through a few things there, but that's my presentation. Long story short, everybody can make it to the Dataverse table, but there's some complexities that you need to keep in mind to configure to make sure that it all works. It's not as seamless as you might imagine. I will stop sharing, and if anyone, oh, there are still people here. Hello. Happy to answer any questions that I can.
My mic is not. Yep, there we go. From Mark. Mark, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you want to ask your questions? That I'm sure you may have had a few that came up.
Well, the first question was around data governance and best practice there, but that's probably a whole other presentation.
Oh, it is. And if you come to PASS, you can see my presentation. But separately, yeah, data governance is so important. Did you have a specific question?
My issue was I've seen lots of people try and implement it and fail, and I haven't really seen any really good examples. I don't know if you have seen it and what those best factors were.
So here's what I've noticed works. And it's an evolving effort because it is an uphill battle. And I think a critical part of the reason that it's an uphill battle is if no one is already responsible for data being correct. A lot of times when people talk about data quality, I've heard the phrase like, whose neck is on the line? If nobody's neck is already on the line, who's going to put their neck on the line, right? How do you make that happen? You have to have leadership buy-in. You need someone at the top who gets it, and figuring out how to communicate that is really hard. But the best way I know of to do this is modularly. So in other words, you have one report that someone really cares about, and that report has data that is incorrect, and it's a pain in the tuchus that it's incorrect. Cool. You use that one report as your starting point for how you're going to get a toehold in data governance. And you're not going to call any of it data governance. You're going to talk about it in business terms. We need this data to be reliable so that our sales team doesn't screw the pooch on our costs, so that we don't lose money. Cool. How do we make sure that the 6 data points that we need for this calculation are reliable? And who's going to be responsible for making sure that those stay right? Because they're that important for our business. Great. Write that down. If you can, get it in their job description and make sure that you track and maintain it. Data governance is about people. And because data governance is about people, it's also about politics. So it is truly an uphill battle, and that's never going to change. But if you can start segmenting off based on core business needs, you're much more able to tie it directly to business outcomes. And you're much more able to get that level of incremental buy-in that you need to make progress. It's also a hell of a lot cheaper and more efficient to get that chunk right and then move to the next chunk than it is to try to have an overarching data governance project that lasts a year, and at the end of it, you have a catalog. That sort of big bang approach, I've never seen work. It just results in people who care very deeply being very frustrated. So start small, attach everything that you can to the business outcomes, and get the buy-in because it matters to everyone to get this right. Not because data governance best practices say in the DAMA DIMBOK. Nobody cares about the DAMA DIMBOK except for nerds like me. That's how you make progress in data governance.
Oh, great idea. My other question was completely different. As a
Sure.
technical point on inserting columns into a grid. I've always been looking for the name of the data entity, but I don't see it there. I see the table of the fields, but which data entity is it referring to, or is it not?
It's going to depend on what the form's connected to. When those relationships are already there, That helps to give you a sense of why and how those are in place. So if that logic is already available and that connection is already in place because Microsoft expected you to want it, it'll be there. You can put some extra effort into configuring that, but juice is often not worth the squeeze at that point. A lot of times the conversation becomes, do you make the report, the tool, the form in D365 F&O versus in a Power BI report? And the answer is always it depends, which everyone hates. But if you really need that data to be repeatedly available and it's not easy to access it, such as by personalizing that form, that's a logical opportunity to build a straightforward Power BI report outside of the system that can better meet that need with less customizations in D365.
Thanks.
Great questions. Thank you so much. I love anytime anyone asks about data governance. Needs so much more love. Any other questions? Cool. Just do some jazz hands here. Sevi, anything else before we call it a day, my friend?
No, this was a great session. Thank you so much, Laura, on putting it together. I'm sure there'll be some follow-up questions as well. And no, I think we're good. Does anyone have any last-minute ideas, questions, comments?
Sevi, the only thing I was going to say is just for anyone on the call still, and we'll send out a reminder for the in-person session in October, just say what time of the day works best for you all to potentially join. And then hopefully we can get a tally of who's heading down to Summit in a couple weeks and get another meetup.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Lenore. This is awesome.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
See, exit.